The scent of roasted turkey and sage drifted through Camille's home on Madison's west side, the kind of warm, brick-front colonial that looked like it had been pulled from a holiday postcard. I walked in carrying a pie dish balanced in both hands. The pumpkin custard still faintly warm from my oven. It was the same recipe I had made for decades, spiced just enough. The crust rolled thin with patience. Camille's voice rang across the dining room. "Isn't this centerpiece stunning, Mom? You outdid yourself again." She was beaming at Eleanor, who preened at the compliment. The centerpiece was a glossy arrangement of store-bought lilies, their stems hidden in a silver vase. Eleanor tapped the rim as though it were a trophy. "Lorraine," my daughter called, almost as an afterthought. "You can set your pie over on the sideboard." She gestured vaguely, her eyes already back on her mother-in-law. I slid the dish onto the edge of the crowded table, unnoticed by anyone else. Eleanor took the head seat without hesitation, her bracelets clinking as she settled in. Camille had placed her there, of course, and positioned Greg at the other end. I found a spot halfway down, squeezed between one of the grandchildren and a chair pulled from the kitchen. It wasn't that I expected honor, but the contrast was sharp. I had raised Camille through scraped budgets and long winters, yet here I sat in the margins, while Eleanor was crowned matriarch. Conversation flowed around me, mostly about Eleanor's opinions on the new cafe near the Capitol Square, and her suggestions for redecorating Camille's living room. Each comment earned laughter, nods, a quick note of agreement. I caught myself smoothing the napkin on my lap, listening without joining. 10 years of this holidays where my presence was acknowledged, but my voice brushed aside. My role quietly replaced by someone more glamorous. I glanced at the pie, its crust gleaming, half hidden in the shadows at the edge of the buffet. It looked out of place beside Eleanor's towering centerpiece, the same way I often felt in this house. My hands folded, then stilled. Camille reached for Eleanor's hand. "I don't know what I'd do without you." And I thought, not for the first time, that my daughter had long ago given my seat away. I lifted my glass, forcing a smile, already bracing for another year of silence that stretched beyond the table into every corner of our lives. It hadn't always been so obvious. In the first years of Camille's marriage, I told myself the balance of attention was natural, that every daughter leaned toward her husband's family at times. But as the years stretched, it became clear that I had been quietly replaced. When Camille discovered she was pregnant with her first child, I learned about it 2 days after Eleanor. I wanted to tell her right away. Camille explained over the phone, her voice light with excitement. "You understand." I congratulated her, though my throat tightened as I hung up. Vacations followed the same pattern. Each summer, Camille and Greg packed the children into their SUV and drove north to Door County, Eleanor in the passenger seat. They'd send me postcards with quick scribbles, never invitations, just updates. "Next year, you'll come," Camille would say, but next year never arrived. Holidays rotated around Eleanor's calendar, her preferences dictating whether we gathered in Milwaukee, Chicago, or stayed in Madison. I learned to wait for instructions. The sharpest memory came at Camille's wedding. The church in Milwaukee glowed with candlelight, satin ribbons draped over polished pews. I found my seat near the back, behind a row of Eleanor's extended family. Up front, Eleanor sat close to the altar, her corsage bright against her dress. During the reception, Camille danced 3 times with her mother-in-law before I had my turn. When she finally reached me, flushed and glowing, she said, "Don't be upset, Mom." It means a lot to her. Over the years, I watched Eleanor's opinions weigh more than mine. What color Camille should paint the kitchen, which preschool the children should attend, even how to season the Thanksgiving turkey, all filtered first through Eleanor. I learned to stay quiet, to nod, to make myself small. Yet silence does not erase memory. It piles up, layer upon layer, until even the smallest slight carries the weight of years. So when I sat at the edge of Camille's table that Thanksgiving night, I wasn't only mourning one holiday. I was carrying a decade of shadows, each one stretching longer than the last, waiting for the moment when I would finally decide not to shrink anymore. David was 47 when the highway turned slick near Janesville. One December evening, headlights never reached our driveway again. Camille was a junior in high school, full of plans for prom and college applications. I was left with a mortgage, a daughter, and silence that settled over the house like a permanent frost. I found steadiness the only way I could, by working. The University of Wisconsin-Madison offered me longer hours at the library, and I accepted every shift they had. Mornings were spent cataloging archives, evenings shelving books, weekends running study rooms. I rarely let myself sit down at home. The rhythm of work dulled grief, even as exhaustion became my closest companion. Camille's tuition was my first goal. I tucked away every dollar, even skipped repairs on the house so her application to Marquette wouldn't be another reminder of what we couldn't afford. When her acceptance letter arrived, I cried in the kitchen, not because of the future she'd secured, but because I knew I could make it possible. Years earlier, after my father's death, I had inherited a stretch of farmland outside Green Bay, 80 acres of soil that had grown corn and hay through 3 generations. The land was too much for me to manage, so I sold half, placing the proceeds into a small account at the Dane County Credit Union. An advisor suggested I consider mutual funds. I listened. What began as a cautious step turned into a quiet education. I read annual reports after midnight, circled articles in the Wall Street Journal, and learned to study markets the way other women studied recipes. Each year, the numbers climbed slowly at first, then with startling speed. By the time Camille was building her own household, my accounts had multiplied in ways I hardly dared admit, even to myself. I told no one. The neighbors saw only a widow who drove an aging sedan and lived in the same modest bungalow she had for decades. The truth was different. Beneath the quiet, I had built something solid, something I protected with secrecy over 3 decades. The figure reached $13 million, more than enough to shift the balance of any family table. And yet, no one knew, least of all Camille, who still measured my worth by the seat she offered me. Eleanor knew how to make herself indispensable. She had the kind of confidence that filled every room, and Camille clung to it as if it were oxygen. Over time, I noticed my daughter's words shifting, her voice echoing opinions that weren't her own. If Eleanor thought a restaurant downtown was overrated, Camille would repeat it at the next gathering as though it had been her idea. If Eleanor dismissed a neighbor's new car, Camille would smirk and agree, never questioning. The first time I heard Camille call her mom in public, my stomach tightened. We were in line at the Overture Center for a holiday concert. The usher handed Eleanor her ticket, and Camille slipped her arm through hers. "Thanks, Mom," she said brightly. While I stood behind them with my program folded tight in my hands, Christmas only sharpened the divide. That year, in Eleanor's living room beneath a tall artificial tree dripping with gold ornaments, Camille handed out gifts with eager anticipation. Eleanor opened a small velvet box and gasped at the silver bracelet nestled inside. "Oh, darling, it's perfect," she said, pulling Camille into an embrace. My package came next, a pair of fleece slippers wrapped in tissue paper. "I figured yours were worn out," Camille said, smiling distractedly as she turned back toward Eleanor's delight. I slipped them on, nodding, though my chest ached. The Hartmans kept a photo wall in the hallway leading to the kitchen. Each visit, I noticed the frames multiplying Eleanor at the children's birthdays. Eleanor cutting the Thanksgiving turkey. Eleanor beside Camille at the lake. My image, when it appeared at all, was tucked into the corners. A blurred face in the background of a larger moment. It was as if my presence had become incidental, useful only for filling space. I told myself that what mattered was that Camille was happy, that she had found stability in marriage and family. But beneath that reasoning lived something harder to ignore, the sting of being slowly erased, of watching another woman occupy the place I had fought to hold. The pie I carried each Thanksgiving, the careful gifts I chose each Christmas, the quiet hours I had spent working so Camille could build her life, all of it seemed invisible beside Eleanor's glittering presence. I stayed silent, though every year that silence grew heavier, pressing against the parts of me I had once believed unshakable, waiting for the day it would finally break. My house on the east side of Madison is small, the kind built for utility rather than show. The siding is weathered, the shutters need paint, and the maple tree out front scatters its leaves across the walk each autumn. From the street, no one would guess there was anything remarkable inside. That was how I preferred it. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I opened the cedar trunk at the foot of my bed. Beneath quilts and photographs rested a worn metal lockbox, the one my father had pressed into my hands before his health declined. The paint on its lid had chipped, and the latch stuck before it gave way. Inside lay the record of a lifetime yellowing stock certificates, neat envelopes holding land deeds, and notebooks filled with columns of numbers I had tallied through the years. I carried the contents to the kitchen table and spread them out like a puzzle only I could solve. One by one, I recalculated. The farmland sold decades ago had become shares in companies whose names now filled headlines. Mutual funds I had chosen carefully kept growing while I lived simply. The numbers added themselves with quiet precision until the total sat before me in ink. $13.2 million. For a moment, the room tilted. My refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. And yet the figure seemed unreal, as if it belonged to someone else's story. I thought of Camille, who assumed my worth ended with casseroles and coupons. I thought of Eleanor, who measured value in how many times her picture hung on Camille's wall. And I thought of the long nights I'd worked at the library, setting aside what I could while no one noticed. At the bottom of the lockbox lay a small brass key attached to a faded tag. Dane County Credit Union. Box 47. I turned it over in my palm, its ridges pressing into my skin. That key represented every choice I had made in silence, every sacrifice folded into discipline. I slipped it onto a ring I kept hidden in my dresser, a reminder that what I carried was mine alone to guard. I told myself I would protect it until the day came when I no longer could, when truth and necessity collided, and silence could not hold the weight anymore. And as I locked the box again, I knew that day was closer than I wanted to believe. That Thanksgiving, I carried a small velvet box in my coat pocket, its weight oddly heavier than it should have been. Inside lay a necklace I had inherited from my grandmother, a delicate chain with a pendant of garnet surrounded by seed pearls. Over the years, I'd had the clasp reset, the metal strengthened, but otherwise, it remained untouched. I told myself it was time to pass it on, that Camille should have something from her own family instead of trinkets chosen by Eleanor. After dinner, when the table had been cleared and the children ran shrieking down the hallway, I placed the box in front of Camille. "Just a little something," I said, trying to sound casual. She lifted the lid, and for a brief second her eyes softened. The garnet glowed in the light of the chandelier, the chain catching each flicker. Before she could speak, Eleanor leaned forward. "Oh my," she said. Her tone clipped. "It's very old-fashioned. Sweet, but not really Camille's style." Camille's smile faltered. She glanced at her mother-in-law, then back at me. It's nice. Mom, thank you. The words were polite, but the sneer tugging at her mouth was harder to hide. She set the box down as if it were an obligation rather than a gift. But as conversation moved on, I noticed her fingers drifting back to the clasp, turning it over, testing its weight. She studied the setting longer than necessary. Her brows pinched. "Is this real gold?" she asked finally, her voice carrying across the room. Greg shifted in his chair, eyes flicking from the necklace to me. "It looks valuable," he said quietly, almost uneasily. Camille's tone sharpened. "Where did you get this?" "Mom, I don't remember you ever wearing it." "It belonged to my grandmother," I answered evenly. "I thought it should stay in the family." Her gaze lingered, suspicious now, the way a person studies a closed door they hadn't noticed before. Eleanor pursed her lips, dismissive, but Camille kept staring at me as though she had glimpsed something deeper, hidden beneath years of modest cardigans and quiet habits. The room shifted, an undercurrent pulling at the edges of conversation, and I knew the gift, meant as a bridge, had instead opened a crack that would not close again. The phone buzzed just as I was helping clear plates, a call I couldn't ignore. One of my advisors needed confirmation on a land trust adjustment, and I stepped into the hallway to answer. My voice was low, but numbers have a way of carrying percentages, dividends, and settlement dates slip easily through thin walls. When I returned to the dining room, Camille's phone was in her hand. She wasn't scrolling idly. Her eyes were sharp, narrowed, scanning with purpose. A moment later, she looked up, pale and tight-lipped. "Lorraine Whitmore," she said. Her voice clipped. "That's you, isn't it? The filings in Dane County, the trust accounts." The room stilled. Greg set down his fork. Eleanor's bracelet stopped clinking. Camille's voice rose. $13 million. That's what it says. All this time you let me think you lived on library wages and Social Security. While you've been sitting on a fortune, I drew in a breath. Steady, but she didn't wait. "Do you have any idea what I've struggled with? What Greg and I could have done with that?" And you, her finger jabbed toward me. "You sat by, letting Eleanor take the place of honor, pretending you were some martyr. Selfish doesn't even begin to cover it." Eleanor shifted in her chair, clearly flustered, but unwilling to lose ground. "Lorraine," she said, her tone smoothing the edges of Camille's fury. "Family supports family. You can't hoard resources while your own daughter enough." My voice cut sharper than I intended. For years I had swallowed silence, but now it surged out of me. "I paid every tuition bill when your father died. Camille, I worked double shifts so you could walk across that stage without debt. I sold half of my family's farm so you could start a life. And for 10 years, I've sat at tables where you praised another woman as if I never existed." The air trembled. Greg looked down. Eleanor pressed her lips together. My words fell heavy, not shouted. Just final. Camille's chair scraped back hard against the wood floor. She grabbed her coat, fury bright on her face, and stormed out without another glance. I remained at the table, the silence thicker than gravy, knowing nothing would be the same when the door shut behind her. The next morning, the calls began. Camille's number flashed again and again until finally she appeared on my doorstep, Eleanor close behind her. The air between them carried the same charge as the night before. Camille didn't waste time. "You owe me," she said flatly. $13 million. Mom, you've let me scrape by while you sat on all that. A down payment, retirement security, whatever. It's the least you can do. Eleanor's voice followed. Smooth, but edged. She's right. Lorraine, family looks after its own. You wouldn't want people thinking you've turned cold to your daughter. I stood with my hands on the doorframe, the brass key heavy in my pocket. For a long moment I listened to their insistence, the same refrain looping: money, obligation, debt. Then I answered. "I don't owe you a cent," I said. "Not after 10 years of being set aside for someone else. I gave you everything I could when you needed it most. My time, my wages, my future. And in return, you erased me. Now you come only because you've seen a number. That isn't love. It's entitlement." Camille's mouth fell open, but no words came. Eleanor pressed her lips together, unable to disguise her irritation. I closed the door gently, not slammed, and let their silence settle on the other side. Inside, I walked to the bedroom and pulled open the dresser drawer. The brass key lay warm in my palm. I placed it in the small home safe with the lockbox, then tore a slip of paper from a notebook. On it, I wrote one word: boundaries. I folded the note, slid it on top of the box, and turned the dial until it clicked shut. That evening, Greg arrived alone. He stood awkwardly in the living room, twisting his wedding ring. "I don't agree with how Camille spoke to you," he said quietly. "I know what you've carried, even if she doesn't. Thank you for everything you did, and everything you still do." His voice faltered, but the sincerity was clear. After he left, the house was still. I sat at the table where my father's ledgers once lay, the safe locked tight in the next room, and felt the quiet press closer. Not heavy this time, but protective, as if it was finally my own. 2 weeks later, I walked into a law office just off the Capitol Square in Madison. The attorney, a gray-haired man named Richard Talbot, slid a new draft of my will across the polished oak desk. His pen waited at the margin for my signature, but my eyes lingered on the words that mattered most. Camille Whitmore removed. In her place, a line reserving nothing for her. No loopholes, no share to be claimed. Richard cleared his throat. "Are you certain?" I nodded. "Completely." The next page detailed the trust I had asked him to establish. Each grandchild would have tuition, books, and housing secured through the fund no matter how the years unfolded. The money could only be released for education, and Eleanor's hands, or Camille's, would never touch it. Richard noted the safeguards I had insisted on, then passed me the final page. Back home, I opened the safe once more. Inside lay the brass key, the ledgers, the note marked boundaries. I placed the antique necklace on top of the folder holding my will. Its garnet shimmered faintly in the low light, a reminder of history, both fragile and enduring. Camille never called again. Eleanor's name stopped appearing on the invitations she once dictated. Their absence left no gap, only space. I saw my grandchildren when Greg brought them by, their laughter carrying through my modest bungalow, their drawings taped to my refrigerator. They would never know the years of erasure, only that their future had been quietly secured. As I turned the lock on the safe, I thought of the empty seat at Camille's table, the one I had carried like a wound for a decade. It no longer bound me. Eleanor's influence had collapsed, Camille's demands silenced, and the weight of secrecy lifted. In the end, it was simple. She lost it all.